Today's Imprint Weekly podcast is brought to you by Accenture. Change is afoot in child welfare. Change that means agencies focus on results for children and keep far more of them safe at home with their own families. Accenture's child welfare team is leading the way in the effort to ensure technology does its part in that success story. Accenture offers cutting-edge case management tools that ensure agencies can see insights that drive decision-making and caseworkers have information they need at their fingertips. Together, these tools help agencies stay laser-focused, reinventing child welfare into a source of strength for families when they need it. For more information, visit www.accenture.com/childwelfare.
Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. On this week's podcast, Karen Dessau, our very own executive editor here at the Imprint, joins us to reminisce on Drugging Our Kids, one of the biggest investigative projects of her career, and a series that recently, research indicates, has had a substantial impact on foster care in California. Before we get to that, let's do a few headlines for the week. The House of Representatives last week passed the Mental Health Matters Act, a bill that just days earlier the White House had released a statement of administrative policy in support of. SAPs are generally kind of an indication of whether or not the president is going to sign something if it gets to his desk. In this case, they're saying that he would in fact do that. I'll link to a little outline of the bill, which contains three youth-related pots worth mentioning. First is what appears to be, in my reading, a $5 billion per year stream that states could use to basically take and subgrant down to local education agencies or school districts for accessing mental health providers at high need schools. And there's a match requirement to that money. You got to put up, as a state, 20% of what you're getting overall. Second pot is a $200 million grant program to help increase the number of mental health providers that might actually take those jobs at high need schools and elsewhere. And then finally, there's what looks, if I'm reading it right, as $100 million over 10 years for the Administration on Children and Families at HHS to identify and then review interventions or curricula that would be aimed at improving child behavioral health, and then implement and evaluate those programs at participating Head Start programs. So basically study up on what works and then test and evaluate those things on the Head Start population. Now, there does not seem to have been much or really any action on this in the Senate, so possibly something that could end up, in the inevitable year-end legislation that's surely coming in December. Were this to become law, between it and the many youth mental health provisions in the gun-related legislation that passed after the Uvalde school shooting this summer, there will have been a pretty massive increase in federal funds for more mental health services for youth, and the vast majority of those funds are being routed through the schools. So we're putting a big bet on school capacity to kind of become a much, much bigger conduit of referring kids to mental health services and then actually providing it on school grounds. Speaking of Head Start and child well-being, though, some negative news here. The Inspector General for the Department of Health and Human Services last month issued a report recommending that ACF, that's the Administration for Children and Families, improve the oversight on Head Start programs when it comes to child safety. Reviewing records from between 2015 and 2020, the IG's office found that about a quarter of all Head Start grant recipient programs had received what's called an adverse finding from ACF for either child abuse, lack of supervision, or unauthorized release of kids, which I think generally usually means sending a kid home with somebody who is not authorized to take them. And that many programs did not report incidents in a timely manner and sometimes did not do so at all. And that last point about not reporting at all seems to have alarmed or jumped out to the IG as well, because, their office did sort of an additional 2-state case study on Florida and Texas to try and get at how many incidents of child abuse or lack of supervision in particular had gone unreported to ACF. So what they found in the whole subset from 2015 to 2020 on all states is there were about 1,029 incidents over a total of 5 years. Just in the 2-state 3-year sample from Florida and Texas, the IG found what they said is at least 130 incidents that had gone unreported. In Texas, the vast majority of those were child abuse incidents. So that's a decent indicator there might be intentional or unwitting failure to be transparent about incidents where Head Start staff physically hurt a child or leave them unsupervised in a way that can jeopardize their safety. We'll link to the report for anybody who wants to delve into it a little deeper. It's not that long. ACF did agree with the IG's recommendations around better guidance, better data sharing, and including reports of youth who are at a Head Start program but are not covered, so to speak, by a Head Start grant, which I guess was an issue that came up too. A few weeks ago on the podcast, we discussed the recent analysis of a decades-long plummeting in child poverty that was recently put out by Child Trends and the New York Times. Their work looked into the reasons behind a steady drop from nearly 30% rate of child poverty in 1993 all the way down to about 11% in 2019 before the pandemic hit. And this assessment used the supplemental poverty measure for calculating poverty, which in general means it counts aid from government programs as income. Using 2019 as a bookend was intentional as opposed to including 2020 numbers, which were available to them, but of course cover to some extent really this craziest array of social restrictions and surges in government aid that have ever probably happened in this country. But the Times Child Trends work did note that child poverty had indeed fallen again in 2020, down to 9.7%. And now the Census Bureau data for 2021 is out, and it shows a staggering drop of almost 50% from 2020 down to 5.2% child poverty in 2021. So we went in 1993 from 1 in 3 kids, give or take, living in child poverty down to now 1 in 20. There are for sure plenty of reasons around this. For one, the economy improved in 2021, even if it's on shaky ground now for myriad reasons. And not only had a number of new states begun to raise the minimum wage in their state, Florida comes to mind as one that's doing a pretty dramatic increase, the so-called Great Resignation had the effect of driving wages up in a lot of industries without any laws mandating it and without driving up unemployment at the same time. But it seems increasingly likely now that the Advanced Child Tax Credit, which raised the amount of the usual credit, removed work requirements, and turned it into a monthly distribution from the feds, had the biggest part to play here. I'm sure Child Trends and others in the research world will be doing the work of assigning causal connections and studying that, but it's really honestly impossible that there was a year with a vastly more generous child allowance like this and a year where child poverty was halved and that those two things had nothing to do with each other. Now, for child welfare, the looming question here is what happened in 2021 in child welfare indicators as child poverty continued to plummet. We know that reports and confirmation of maltreatment dropped a ton in 2020, largely in part due to social restrictions. Kids were not in school. School officials were not calling CPS hotlines. And then foster care also saw its single biggest drop in recent memory in 2020. What happened in 2021 as schools and other parts of society reopened and a mix of high wages and generous government supports were driving down poverty? That is sort of the million-dollar question here. Last but not least for this week, I wanted to commend a couple of recent Imprint pieces of reporting to everybody. We have some great stuff that has gone up on the website in the last week or so. I'm just going to highlight two of them. First, we have a great story-video combination by reporter Jeremy Loudenbeck and Carlos Ayala about Mick Williams, who honed his artistic skills as a young man behind bars and then entered the world of professional dog grooming. His specialty is in creating outside-the-box designs and styles for poodles. So our video captures a day at one dog competition that he and his son Mick Jr. enter. It's really, both the story and the video are really great to check out. Second one, Michael Fitzgerald wrote on the retirement of Marty Guggenheim, who is a New York law professor who for many decades has been a pioneer and leader in the push for high-quality legal defense for parents who are involved with the child welfare system. His views on the matter are much more mainstream now than when he started about 50 years ago, which is widely credited to his contributions on major cases in advocacy and perhaps most in developing a future generation of lawyers with a specific background and expertise in representing parents. All right, when we come back, our conversation with Imprint executive editor Karen Dessau.
This episode is sponsored by iFoster. If you're listening to this podcast, we assume you care deeply about improving the foster care system. Last year, more than 2,400 youth, caregivers, and frontline workers from across the nation took the time to tell iFoster what's needed to improve foster care in this country. Their voices are being heard, and now it's your turn. Please join this year's Voice of the Community survey, available online now at voiceoffostercare.org. That's voiceoffostercare.org.
In August of 2014, the Mercury News, one of the largest papers in California, began to publish a series called Drugging Our Kids, which exposed how much county foster care systems in the state had come to rely on powerful psychiatric drugs to control behavior and how little the state was paying attention to that practice. The series led to significant legislative and policy changes in California aimed at ensuring a meaningful process for reviewing and authorizing these drugs. And recent research published in the Journal of Child and Adolescent Psychopharmacology looks at what the impact of those changes has been. Now, I will link to our reporting on this new research, which is co-published with the Mercury News. But joining me today is the architect of that original series back in 2014, who also happens to be the boss now here at the Imprint, executive editor Karen Dessau. Karen, thanks for joining me on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you for having me, John.
We got to start the same as we always do, give the listeners a little chance to get to know you. So give me at least one of your favorites: book, TV show, movie, sports team, or musical group. Karen Dessau, what do you got?
I spent the past weekend in a deep immersion in all things Sidney Poitier because he was one of my all-time favorite humans on earth, it's safe to say. There's a new documentary out by Oprah. It features Quincy Jones, Morgan Freeman, Denzel Washington, Spike Lee. It's really an all-star cast, and it actually has really interesting backstory on Sidney Poitier, and then just binge watched all the favorites. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, the whole 9 yards. So that is my big.
I guess I'm a bandwagon Sydney fan, and that In the Heat of the Night is my favorite. But I guess I will allow that. I should probably have this as a category that you could give me your favorite actor or actress, instead of a movie. So there you go. Sydney Poitier is the
spare you singing to Sir with Love right now. You could also do that.
We could do that as like as a cutout,
Close out,
a little clip. Okay, that's cool.
Please do.
So 2014 is the publishing date on the very first story of Drugging Our Kids, but that this was a major investigation. So I think it'd be fun to kind of take listeners inside this whole thing. So let's just start with when this journey began for you in the Mercury News. Like, how did you stumble onto this, the kind of kernel of what became this, and how did you get started on the reporting?
I like that question and the way you phrased it, because after almost 30 years in this business, I feel like every story and definitely every investigative project is a journey. And the journey starts and continues to surprise you in all kinds of unexpected ways. And this one was most definitely a journey. I had been an investigative reporter really focusing on child welfare and juvenile justice for, the bulk of my career. And I was, always on the lookout for untold stories. And I had written a lot about kind of the dysfunctional dependency in family courts, the hazards of congregate care, some of the topics that were really kind of very, very apparent in the foster care system. Good stories and good projects always come from just covering a beat. Usually, the journalistic heavens don't drop the Panama Papers in your lap. It does happen, but not all the time. So, these were just my really good sources at that time at the National Center for Youth Law. And they were like, hey, this thing everyone's talking about in nursing homes about the excessive use of psychotropic drugs and how older people are being, over medicated and harmed by these medications. And Congress was up in arms because, everyone had a parent in this situation, and it hasn't really been examined in the foster care population. The other really interesting and surprising thing that was apparent to me early on was the connection with big pharma. And we can talk about that later, but that's what I said, this might be an interesting story. And I literally remember where I was standing. I was standing outside the Santa Clara County Juvenile Hall, getting ready to follow some kid's case. And I remember standing at the gate, hearing about this story, saying, that's my next project. And that began a 3-year journey. So the first obstacle was getting the data, because any decent investigative project usually has, a database. So this was the big hurdle. And this took the better part of a year to obtain a usable data set. And we put together something that had never been done before, which was a combination of pharmacy benefit claims prescribed to foster youth through the Medi-Cal system. And we had another data set with the list of the prescribers. And then we had a whole nother data set, which was those prescribers who received gifts and speaking money and financial rewards of any kind from the pharmaceutical industry, from the manufacturers of the drugs. So just to get the numbers of kids in California, their ages, and what drugs they were prescribed and how many drugs they were prescribed was really, really a bear. It's the most difficult thing I've ever had to do in terms of reporting multiple Public Records Act requests. We had to, at a certain point, the Mercury News, I went with my top editor at the paper, which was very unusual. We went to Sacramento with our company lawyer, and we took a University of San Francisco expert who had worked with big, huge data sets. And we went to the Capitol to meet with the Department of Social Services. I mean, we had to really, really fight. We got bunk data. We got data that didn't make sense. We had to go back a million times, not a million, but what I mean.
Yeah.
I get paid to exaggerate. So, and we also had to make sense of it all. Some people inside the department got in a bit of trouble for answering some questions. I mean, it was rough going, but we did finally produce data on how many kids in California who are in foster care were being prescribed and what, and we were able to come up with some findings. So that was like the first big score.
Yeah. So we're going to get to the findings in 1 second, but just to recap all that, this goes from, basically credible folks telling you this thing with overprescribing that's being kind of like, that's front and center now with older folks. This is happening here. Okay. So we got to go and find that and really actually nail that down in data. So you got to connect the data on the drugs to the kids, and then you also have to and the drugs to the prescribers, and then kind of bank shot or tangential to that, what else is going on with these prescribers. So you're going to get all this stuff, and then I would imagine on a kind of concurrent track, you're starting to get to know and interview young people who've experienced foster care and just kind of get that qualitative part to the story going at the same time.
A question asked from one truly knowledgeable journalist to another. So, as you know, there's very rarely a story in journalism worth telling that doesn't tell you about the people impacted, right? A story about a whole bunch of numbers and data, no matter how striking the findings are not meaningful unless you can tell them through a person. So the next big hurdle was finding people to tell this story. And so when you think about, I'm in my mid 50s and like talking about my deepest, darkest traumas and my treatment and telling the world about it and talking to a stranger about it is no small feat. I mean, unfortunately or fortunately, foster youth are telling their stories a lot. They're telling their stories to lawyers and judges and social workers and foster parents. And, there is that kind of telling that's built into their lives. But, I think we did hundreds of interviews over 2 years. I mean, I think all told it was 275. It wasn't just foster youth, but definitely we needed to find people. And when I look back on the people that actually told the story in an in-depth way, my takeaway is their incredible bravery and the trust that they gave in me and us, and in my partner on this project was Di Sagano, who is a very, very incredibly skilled photographer and videographer. And we spent a year or more just chilling with some young people. I mean, I'd come over and Di would be playing video games with D'Anthony, and we did Chipotle, and we hung out, we had meals, we just went back time and time again. This wasn't just an interview in and out. The folks that really shared their stories with us really made it all come alive. And we have some remarkable characters in the Drugging Our Kids series. Rochelle Trachtenberg went on to become the foster care ombudsperson for the state of California, a huge job. She spoke in very, very moving terms about her experiences on medication. Dandy was in 27 foster homes, bounced all over the place, and he gave me permission. We talked to one of his prescribers. We talked to his CASA. We talked to his mom. We got archival footage of when he met his mom and this hug that he got from his mom after not seeing his mom. I mean, we went really deep. We went with Yolanda. We arranged a meeting at her favorite foster mom's house with the psychiatrist and the nurse practitioner who tapered her off something like 10 medications. And we relived that journey on camera. So I guess the other beautiful thing of this project that was unusual is that we were filming this the whole time. So this was not only a 5-part newspaper series, but it was also a 45-minute video documentary, which we can also talk to.
Yeah, I will. And for listeners, I'm definitely going to. I will post, for anybody that has not read it yet, the Drugging Our Kids series link in our show notes. I will also just separately, hip everybody to the YouTube video, the YouTube version of the video, which is really powerful. And I think what you just kind of described speaks to what sets that series apart from other great ones, in that I think you guys, it seemed effortless. I'm sure it was not in putting it together, but really it wasn't just about the use of the drugs. There's so many things tied to it, the pain of separation, the many different placements, other things going on. And I think I just felt like you guys kind of tied it together and didn't ignore those things to just, myopically pursue this one aspect of their life, which was very serious and touched by all those things,
Well, and I appreciate you saying that, John. And I think that, the reason that this story in terms of the excessive use of psychiatric drugs was particular to the population that we're examining, because foster youth have really a trifecta of experiences going on that make them just have a particular urgency. I mean, they have the trauma. They have the trauma of what may have gone on at home. They have the trauma of foster care. They have no parents looking out for them. And with the older youth, they tend to have moved around a lot. They've had a dizzying array of doctors and prescribers and teachers and social workers and lawyers. And, they are often prescribed medication with no medical records at all. I mean, if you're getting a call from a group home in the middle of the night and the kid is bouncing off the walls or suicidal, God forbid, or, you're going to get a prescription. The doctor doesn't have medical history, medical records. Sometimes those don't even exist anyway, even in a good foster home. There's no baseline exam. There's no consistent care. There's no metabolic screening. There's no check-in. There's often the urgent need to control a damaging behavior, control a frightful behavior. And so there is a life-saving potential for psychotropic drugs. It's not that we use antidepressants and anti-anxiety meds throughout society. Kids of all young people and adults of all classes, of all races, of all sectors of society have relied on drugs, and it has been helpful. And it's not that this is an indictment on any kind of psychiatric drug. It's just that when you have these circumstances where there is so much rawness and so little oversight and so much need for real and genuine healing from trauma and from just the kind of chaos and terror that these children live in every day, to just keep blunting that with drug after drug after drug after drug. Try this one, try that one, try another one, up the dosage. And like, and that was the other piece of the bravery of this series, is child psychiatrists saying, this is malpractice. This is, no parent would allow this to happen to their child if they had any control over it. And really we had kind of a bravery in the medical profession of people saying, this is not cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Like there's one in the video, and I'm assuming, I can't remember offhand, but I'm sure she was quoted in the stories too. But Susan Bullard, who was a nurse you guys talked to, right? She makes a comment where she's describing kind of the scenarios under which youth get, heavily medicated, and her kind of supposition was that giving the child a pill is not the answer, was her quote. And it kind of like struck me. I think it is the answer, but the question that's being asked is wrong. Like by providers in that moment, they're saying, how can I get a kid under control?
Yes.
How can I get them into this placement that's not going to take them unless I guarantee they're on, this or that antipsychotic to control their behavior? And so when the question is that, how do I control? It is the answer, and that's not good. Because
Right.
the question we should be asking is, how can we use a combination of, psychotherapy and treatment and support, and yes, maybe in some cases drugs, to
Right.
actually benefit the child's long-term.
And John,
status.
I've had the hindsight of thought and reflection, and it's like there is the control thing. Like, okay, you're trashing the place, you're punching holes in the wall, that kind of thing. That's a control thing. But then there's also like foster parents and counselors and group homes are like, this child is in terrible, terrible pain. And there's a kind of a desperation. I mean, any parent or friend or aunt or uncle knows this pain. Like when there's a kid in pain, if you're a teacher and a teenager comes to your office distraught, like there's an urgency, just like if they came to you in physical pain, like I want to help this kid. They need, there's like, we have to do something to help them, And so it's like, the easy thing is a pill. And unfortunately, what we all know is that, maybe a temporary numbness or dulling of the pain, but like the real pain is healed through things that just take more time and attention. And that's exercise, and that's theater programs, and that's art, and that's talk therapy, and that's the great outdoors, and that's dance class and Tai Chi. And I don't know. I mean, there yes, other ways of healing, but with kids, not the quickest way to just get them to feel better. So
yeah, I think we've put the cart before the horse a little bit, because I was
yes.
going to ask you to just sort of lay out what the findings are. You did all this work, you do the data, you spend all this time with young people and healthcare professionals and foster care workers and all of this. I don't think we have time to go into every single nook and cranny of what you guys unearthed, but let's lay out for folks, sort of what you found about the patterns of prescriptions, why there's so many of them compared to general population of youth. Go ahead.
Okay. So we came up with some findings on this California data, the largest, the most populous state in the nation. So this is like the biggest group of foster kids you could look at. And we came up with some very discouraging findings about the excessive use of these medications. So I believe, and I have to triple check this, the top line finding was that of the older adolescents, it was something like 1 in 4 was on medications. Over a 10-year window of the foster youth placed on psychotropics, almost 60% were on antipsychotic, which is, these are drugs designed for adults with diagnoses of things like schizophrenia and bipolar and like severe mental illness in adults, not tested on children and used kind of off label, which is a common use of medications, but with some very, very concerning and potentially lifelong medical harm, a tardive dyskinesia, a shaking, numbness, diabetes, obesity, a lot of really, really rapid onset and severe side effects.
Right.
We have doctors piling on prescriptions. So like in certain years, the year that we examined prior to publication, 12% of California foster children were on 2, 3, 4 or more psychiatric drugs at once. Okay, at one time. Okay. And again, these are drugs not necessarily tested on children and definitely not tested in combination. In some group homes, as many as 100 children, 100% of children were on medication. So more than half, and in some of the smaller ones, all of the kids on meds. And we found hundreds of foster children 5 years old and younger.
So what else did you guys find about like the people who were prescribing these drugs and what made it easy, I guess, in some ways to kind of do these things that you're describing, which if any parent, right, was taking their child to psychiatrists and doctors and, we had piled up to like 7 different prescriptions of mostly mental health drugs, that process might have been stopped at some point. So what did you guys learn about the patterns of the prescribers?
Well, what we learned was really concerning because while on the ground you can see how foster parents and group home providers and even, lawyers and social workers might feel the desperate need to get medications to kids who are going to help them or help stabilize them. We found the manufacturers of particularly antipsychotic drugs pushing these drugs really hard in ways that were all about profits and not about people. So we found, California taxpayers spending hundreds of millions of dollars on these medications that are not proven to be safe or effective. We found that the prescribers in foster care who push the most amount of these medications and the highest combinations were the ones that took the most amount of gifts from the drug company. So I think there was like a 3-year period where $14 million was spent wooing California doctors, encouraging them to prescribe these drugs. These specifically foster care prescribers in California were targeted by the drug company and given more gifts and more presents and more speaking engagements. And they in turn prescribed more. So that it was a very, very alarming finding. And we found actually that California's foster care prescribers on average accepted more than double what the typical California physician accepted in gifts from the drug company. The final piece on this was that there were big revelations about how these drug manufacturers misrepresented scientific evidence to the national market to actually sell antipsychotics. They were sued billions and billions of dollars for misrepresenting and telling doctors, don't talk about obesity, don't talk about, and really and they got busted over it and they got fined billions of dollars. But, billions of dollars for some of these drug companies is nothing. They made their money.
For 2 decades, Fostering Families Today magazine has educated families raising and supporting children and youth in foster care. Delivered in print or online 6 times each year, Fostering Families Today gives families the latest tips, strategies, and research on caring for children with traumatic backgrounds. Use promo code PODCAST5 to save $5 on a print or digital subscription today. Just go to fosteringfamiliestoday.com/subscribe and enter PODCAST5 to save $5 on your subscription. That's fosteringfamiliestoday.com/subscribe.
So this all lands quite loudly with policymakers in California. This is one of those instances where journalism, where you can pretty much kind of walk a straight line between putting a story or a series out into the world and actually seeing change happen, which, most days you just have to have faith, right? That raising the public's knowledge about different things is just it's just a boon to the conversation, but this is one where it's a lot more tangible. So, can you kind of talk to listeners a little bit about what the biggest shifts that came in the wake of this thing were? Before I would transition to you on that, I would also note to folks, like the video that Karen's mentioned, they didn't just kind of put this stuff out there and stop talking about it. There was quite a bit, right, of barnstorming the state to kind of get the word out about the series too.
Yep. So like I said, in 30-year career being an investigative reporter, I have had a number of stories that resulted in a law. This one resulted in the passage of 6 laws in California, 6. And so there's a reason for that. And I'll tll you the reason. The reason is Well, it's multifold. One is the participation in the story of the National Center for Youth Law and two main people. One is a extraordinarily dedicated health policy advocate named Anna Johnson, who is now at the John Burton Advocates for Youth organization. But she worked in partnership with a lawyer at the National Center for Youth Law, who's actually deceased now. May he rest in peace, Bill Grimm. These two were going hard on this issue in a way that I have never seen advocates work so hard on. I mean, they were really, really, they were very helpful to us in, helping us craft FOIAs and they worked very hard on legislation that kind of rode off the series being out there. They really had been working on this issue prior to me and continue in Anna's case to this day. The other thing is, because we made this documentary film, I did something unusual. So basically the series was like kind of reported and written and published over 2 years. And then that third year, I kind of took the show on the road. I took this document. I was almost like just out there with the video. We talked to the Judicial Council of California. We talked to tribal court judges, child welfare judges, dependency court judges. We spoke at the Trade Association for the group home providers. I did grand rounds at psychiatric hospitals a couple times, talking to child psychiatrists. We went to the Children's Lawyers National Conference. We talked in schools of social work, public policy, law students at Stanford. I mean, I would like show the video and do a little presentation, and we kept pushing. We kept pushing to get the word out about what we had found. So we didn't kind of just like hope that people went to the newspaper website, and it got kind of embedded. I mean, I don't know if it still is, but it was part of the curriculum for social workers in training in California. It was written up in the British Medical Journal. I think there were a couple other kind of quite prominent medical journals. So it was really out there. The main things that happened in the wake of the series was this treatment authorizations were tightened. So at the actual pharmacy prescribing level, doctors could put in for these prescriptions, but there was a check on the Medi-Cal paying for these things, and doctors had to justify them a little more. And then the subsequent laws were lawyers had to justify them. Judges had to sign off. Social workers had to make the case. Public health nurses were keeping an eye on group homes. There was these 6 laws kind of held people to account for this prescribing. And it really roped in all the various players. The Medical Board of California had to keep an eye on the doctors. There was just a lot more oversight of this prescribing that took place. And that, from what we've learned of late, it looks like it made a difference.
Yeah, we're going to get to that right now. But just a quick question on that sort of tour of the state. Would you say that you were mostly met with surprise, or that sense of like you had put into a media product something that they had suspected or known for years? Like, what was generally the reaction? Like, God, thankfully somebody's told this story already, finally, or more like, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening?
That's a very good question. I'm trying to think of the answer.
I'd imagine for the lawyers, maybe that would have been a surprise to some of them. Whereas like social, like caseworkers probably were like, oh yeah, my kids have been, the older kids on my case would have been putting out, yeah, I've known this forever.
Yeah, I think it was that, John, that was more like, of all the things we have to deal with, like, like, hey, I was just trying to find the kid a place to live, let alone we're looking up his list of prescriptions. Like, it was almost like it had become an afterthought. But meanwhile, if you are the kid and you're in your body, and you either can't stay awake in school because you're so doped up, they use these words, zombie, drugged, doped, can't stay awake. If you're putting on prolific amounts of weight and it's making you feel bad about yourself, if suddenly your lips are twitching and your hands are shaking, you don't know why, nobody told you why. If you're peeing in your bed and you're a teenager in a group home, can you imagine the humiliation? Because you couldn't wake up at night to go to the bathroom? Can you imagine being a teenage boy in a group home and you're waiting? There was these little things that are huge for kids and that no one was paying attention to. They were going to the doctor, they were getting another prescription, the dosage was being up, but like in their bodies, it was hell. It was hell. And then try to get your mind together on top of that. Then trying to heal from the grief, heal from the trauma when just your body feels like such a trap, And so that was the thing no one was accounting for. How does it feel? Go to the doctor. You trust the doctor. The doctor's supposed to be making you feel better.
The story is exposed, the issue is brought to light, the laws change, and now we actually, as you alluded to there, have a little bit of a report card, right, on what these laws did. Not at Apple, nothing is that causal. What do we find here? What did we find out lately?
As you well know, things that aren't counted or tracked or measured can't get fixed. So Indeed. The first thing was how many kids are on these drugs, and that needed some documentation and counting. So once we started that process, then I'd say potentially one of the biggest outcomes of this series was that the Department of Social Services started posting to its data portal all the numbers, to the extent that there's the whole issue with cell size and you can't do really small groups of kids that can be identified, but de-identified data. And I will say that all of this data were de-identified. And just side note, that was part of the difficulty of getting this database was because of HIPAA laws. But they do now regularly track and post, and group homes have requirements also how many kids are on medications and how many, and there's a whole refined set of criteria that they have to post. So this is something that anybody could have gone back and looked at. I've moved on to a different job, as you pointed out. Stanford, a researcher went and started looking at what was now the prescribing patterns. And this article that came out recently in the Journal of Child and Adolescent Psychopharmacology showed that over this decade that they used this, the big takeaway was that the antipsychotic prescribing to foster youth has dropped 58% in California. And that's between 2011 and 2020. In Los Angeles County, where Judge Michael Nash has been very, very insistent that this stay on the forefront of policymakers' agenda, 64% decline in Los Angeles County, which is the largest. Obviously, it's a nation in and of itself. And the downward trend held true across every foster care demographic and region and race and ethnicity. And the declines were most pronounced in children younger than 10. So this issue of the antipsychotics, which are some of the potentially most harmful drugs, really, really on what some would say is a better and more cautious track. That is, I think, what would be considered the good news in terms of the impact for those who are concerned about antipsychotic prescribing. And then there was some news that is cause for some alarm. And I can get into that too, if you'd like.
Yeah, feel free. Are you talking about the general lack of change in the patterns on just broadly psychotropics? I guess we probably should have talked about this earlier, but antipsychotics are a big and probably the most talked about, certainly in this context, class of psychotropics, but there are many other types of psychotropics. So go ahead. Right. Is that what you were going to mention?
Yes, psychotropic is the broad classification of psychiatric drugs. Antipsychotics are one type. There's also mood stabilizers, there's antidepressants, there's ADD meds people are most familiar with. So as a whole, foster children prescribed psychotropics of any type did not go down hardly at all, I don't think, and still remain. Psychotropics are prescribed to about 12% of foster children, and that is more than 2.5 times the rate of prescribing in the general population to children. Now, look, it could be argued that foster children have more problems as children, and that could well be, and that could explain part of it, but I don't think anyone is very comfortable with children, 12% of children being on psychiatric drugs, especially given that the other thing that the study found, which again, I don't think kids in a family with a regular prescriber or pediatrician keeping tabs on them would encounter, which is there's very lacking evidence that they're getting consistent monitoring on these medications. So like blood glucose, cholesterol levels, some of the kind of checks on the organs and things to make sure that there isn't some damage. That those kind of screenings and and ongoing tests do not appear to be happening regularly enough with foster youth.
I think with the psychotropic numbers, which as you pointed out, it's 12.2%. I think now it was 13.3% of youth in 2011. So not this huge, just massive drop off like the antipsychotics. I don't know how readily available the data it would be, and maybe they'd have to go kind of fight for it like you guys did. But it would be interesting to see within that what happened, because like just for one example, it is possible that actually like that some of the youth that would have gotten antipsychotics are getting psychotropics only, or non-antipsychotic psychotropics only, and there are less kids getting the psychotropics, or they are actually using other strategies and medication for more kids, overall. It's just, I think that that's a level that this Stanford study didn't get into. They were just kind of looking at the top line, but I agree with you that it's cause for alarm. I hope they can actually kind of figure out how to drill further down into, what those trends are. In particular, what happened to the youth that would have been given the antipsychotics,
Right.
before,
Right. What did they get instead? And I think that's the concern, that, okay, it could well be that instead of antipsychotics, they're getting a combination of, a mood stabilizer and an antidepressant and anti-anxiety med. And that would not be ideal either. You touched on the kind of final thing that I'd like to kind of discuss here. And this is in our current story, which we co-published with the Mercury News, which teamed up with us to do this follow-up, and Imprint reporters Jeremy Ludenbach and Michael Fitzgerald did the update piece for us recently, is that advocates for youth, the best child psychiatrists, foster parents, all the folks in these young people's lives, lawyers, judges, everyone agrees that, therapy and healing is definitely in order and needed. And it comes in a lot of forms. And while there is a role in some instances for carefully monitored use of medication, there are also some vital elements in addition to talk therapy for kids, which isn't always the greatest. And these are also actually scientifically proven. So, there really are things that work and that help, but it takes time and it takes attention to a child. So, we have people in our story who do equine therapy. We have one girl who gets to go out and talk to some horses and pet them and ride them and stroke them and look in their eyes and have that experience. Rochelle baked bread. She plays with her puppies. Now she goes in kayaks. D'Anthony made music. He had his beats. Yolanda she went to a group home where they had a martial arts class, and there's theater. These are the things that actually bring a person joy and help you balance out the distress, which is, you have to probe the distress. You have to understand it. You have to find peace with it. You have to understand how the trauma affects you, but you do also have to heal. And the problem with drugs is they make you feel better in the moment, but in far too many instances, they don't really help with the healing process. And the healing process needs to be a creative process, and it needs to be someone close to a kid and someone who knows the kid and cares about the kid enough that they can help them find their path to healing. And I think that's the hopeful area that's not related to pharmaceutical industry at all.
That's beautifully stated. I'm going to add one kind of supposition I'm curious for your thoughts on as a closeout here, which is that, the two, in my mind, thinking back on this issue, other than the fact that the GAO basically kind of did a study that showed some of this, right, about psychotropic use being outsized in the foster care population, but the two real holy crap moments were your guys' series and when a 7-year-old child in Florida named Gabriel Myers hung himself in foster care after having been prescribed many different mind-altering drugs, including antipsychotics. In your guys' case, it was excellent reporting that led to policymakers waking up, changing those laws. To their credit, at the time, the Florida leadership on child welfare saw that what happened, and instead of kind of burying their heads in the sand or just trying to no comment their way out of it, set up a dashboard, and they led to similar changes. The process, it involved people reviewing and actually taking some scrutiny towards the prescribers and things like that. And I guess what I want to say is, if either of those things hasn't happened in your state, if somebody hasn't done a very deep dive media wise and tried to attempt what Karen and these guys did at Mercury News, or if you haven't had a terrible tragedy like Florida experienced, there's a really good chance your state still has an issue with overdiagnosing and overprescribing these drugs. I don't think that's hyperbole to say, because it's those two incidents, in your guys' case, the media coverage and Florida tragedy, that prompted it. And I'm not saying every state other than those 48 has an issue with overprescribing, but it's at best an open question if those two things haven't happened to you, right? I mean,
Yeah, and I mean,
it's just too easy to happen, I guess,
yeah,
like.
I think that I would like to say that, especially post or in the midst of the pandemic, that just general sensitivity to mental health issues in all populations and Obamacare and all the different ways in which we are taking mental health much more seriously in this society will trickle down and affect the foster youth, who are, in the end of the day, all of our children.
I think that's not that is a good point, and I should calculate that in that it's not like nobody outside of California read the stories or heard about what happened in Florida. So I do think that there's been a general national effect on stuff like that, plus the GAO study. So here's hoping for more scrutiny by the media or otherwise on this and in other places. We'll wrap this up there. Karen Dessau, executive editor of the Imprint. Thank you for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you, John.
Thanks to Imprint executive editor Karen Dessau for joining us today, and thank you to Accenture and iFoster for sponsoring this episode. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of Fostering Media Connections, a California-based nonprofit that publishes the Imprint, Fostering Families Today, and operates the Youth Voice program. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Onjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you'd consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we'd really appreciate if you would support our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it's super easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow the Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @theimprintnews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always get us on email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.